Hello and welcome to Culture Vultures. I'm Sandy Frye, your host. Our creative director is Nancy Cole. And this is a program that examines the arts and culture around Tampa Bay. Now, if you haven't seen the new site of the Dali Museum and the new Dali Museum, you've got a treat in store for yourself. Make it a promise, a summer promise, to go in and enjoy this incredible museum, which is totally dedicated to this fascinating artist, Salvador Dali. This museum is devoted to Dali and all of his works, and there are many of them. As a matter of fact, this St. Petersburg Dali Museum is the second largest in the world. The only one larger is in Dali's hometown in Catalina, Spain. Now, in Dali's museum here, we have about 100 or 96 of the oil paintings. We have an incredible amount of watercolors. We have other kinds of archival material that help explain Dali himself and his relationship to surrealism and to very many artists of the day whose names you'll know immediately. And with me is the Director of Education at the Dali Museum and a real Floridian, Peter Tosh, and he is going to work with us in getting an image of what it takes to understand Dali and his work. Is that a promise?
That's great, yes, I'll be happy to do that.
Okay, well, first of all, you do have docents, don't you? And your docents have docents.
We
you
do.
have the mature docents and the junior docents. Tell us about that, how many and what they do and how you prepare.
Yeah, we have 130 docents currently. Out of that, about 100 are active, some travel. We have another 15 teen docents, and we have a very active junior docent program that goes through the summer, a summer camp type of program. But I get to work with our guides, and essentially our docents are the guides and our educators for the public. And we have amazingly 70 tours, 70 regularly scheduled tours per week. And that's not including any additional events or specialty tours. So we have a very active tour schedule, which is almost on every half hour. So there's a wide variety of really remarkable people who, give their time and their energies to try to find a way to share Dali with the public in a very unique way. Each one has a very different perspective and tries to tailor their tour a little bit more towards what their interests are.
The group interest or the docent's interest?
A little bit of both. A little bit of both. We have a really strong variety of different backgrounds. We have docents that are practicing psychoanalysts. We have docents who are from the visual arts background. We have mathematicians and teachers and a great deal of retired professionals. So each one finds different things in the story of Dali that they really relate to and resonates with them.
Are there certain things you want to remain as part of an introduction to Dali?
Well, there is. I mean, part of the story is you do have to explain, how did we wind up in St. Petersburg as a museum? A little bit about the relationship between the couple, Reynolds and Eleanor Morse, who put the collection together, and the artist. And then, most importantly, understanding a little bit about Dali's world before looking at the pieces in the collection. So trying to understand that he was from the Catalan region in Figueres, and some of his relationships with people like Federico Garcia Lorca or Luis Buñuel or the Surrealists. So yeah, there's a core bit of information that always has to be shared.
Right. His father was an avocado, a lawyer, and I think a notary as well, which gave him standing. He wasn't particularly pleased when Dali decided to be an artist, and particularly the kind of artist.
Right. He was actually encouraging of Dali's career to be in the visual arts. He thought Dali certainly didn't have the aptitude to follow him in law or some of the other more focused academic pursuits, but he recognized that his son had great talent as a visual artist. But he had always dreamed of his son becoming a professor, having a regular income, living a very stable lifestyle, which of course did not happen.
No, I guess not.
As a matter of fact.
But his first training was very academic.
It was. As a matter of fact, he went through some very traditional patterns, initially influenced by Impressionism on his own, but then eventually he started going to schooling when he was a teenager.
Right.
Then he went to Madrid to study professionally, and he got all the way through the Reina Sofia Museum of Fine Arts
Yes.
until the end when he sabotaged his baccalaureate.
How?
You know, well, essentially there was an opportunity where he was to draw the name of an artist and do an oral presentation for 3 professors, and he drew the name Raphael and said to his professors that he knew far more about Raphael than they did, and he walked out. And so essentially he received all the education that he could have wanted, and at the same time he sabotaged his father's dream to have him be a professional professor. So
very interesting. When did he meet Picasso?
Well, he met Picasso, let's see, it was 1926, so Dali would have been a 22-year-old student. He met him in Paris, and it really changed his world. He went through a very deep Picasso-inspired period that lasted about 3 years. But throughout his life, Picasso was always the most important artist for him to respond to react against, to looked up to as the great hero.
Yeah.
And Picasso wanted to have very little to do with him after Picasso declared himself a communist and Dali moved towards monarchism.
Right.
The relationship was really strained.
That's right. I think Don Carlos visited him in his final hours, almost. But let's go back to his beginnings.
Right.
His particular style, his melting watches, his many melting things. Did they begin with his association with Gala? Who would be his wife?
He was moving in that direction before he met her.
Okay.
Probably right around the time of his graduation or failed graduation in 1926, he was starting to open himself up to a really deep interest in the avant-garde, the European avant-garde. And so he was moving against very traditional paintings that he had seen in the Prado, and was very clear that there was a new movement afoot, that Cubism and Futurism and Dadaism were all happening. And very quickly he moved into an anti-art period inspired by his colleague Joan Miró. And that was when he started to explore, I guess, what we call a soft morphology, a kind of melting, oozing type of structure.
Right.
Yeah, it all started to come around 1927, and then 2 years later, he meets the Surrealists, but he had already been preparing to meet them for 2 years. And that's when he meets Gala.
Yeah, and she was at the time married, as I recall, but it was a real love match, a fascination match, and she turned out to be a very good manager of his career as well.
Absolutely.
She was Russian, was she not?
She was.
Yeah. Was she also a model or an artist?
She was, I guess, what they referred to then, and we still refer to people sometimes in this role as a muse. So she was, she had chosen to not be a creative person in terms of being a writer or a painter, but was a very, very strong judge of the male production in these areas. Right. So her first husband, Paul Eluard, was a Surrealist poet, and they had met as 17-year-olds. So they were very, very young. In a Swiss sanitarium, they met. They were both there for various illnesses and formed a very close relationship. And it lasted for about 10 years, but she also was very, very free with her attentions, and so was very interested in a lot of the other Surrealists. And then she met this young man, Dali, 10 years her junior, and was fascinated by him, and at some point found herself connecting with him in a very specific way. And so she left Paul to remain with Salvador.
Right. It may be she foresaw his salability. The Surrealists, I'm sure, challenged the status quo, but did they sell?
They sold in a very exclusive way. They did have some galleries. There was the Joman Gallery, and in America there was eventually the Julian Levy Gallery in New York City. Not a lot of other galleries beyond that, but there was a small core of wealthy collectors who enjoyed the more unusual, flavor of the Surrealist paintings. But when Dali first joined them, he, although being recognized and celebrated by critics, didn't have an audience or collectors. And so they actually struggled for about 2 to 3 years before they started to find their way into how to sell Dali's paintings.
That's interesting because the Morses, I think they first saw his work really at the run-up to the Second World War.
It's true, right afterwards, yes.
Yeah, and began collecting for about 30 years or so, and then showed in Ohio.
Right.
And had a little museum of their own, sort of a pocket museum.
Right.
And then really understood that they had something much more grand to show and give to people. And obviously their affection for it was very sincere. And we are very lucky to have this kind of a museum, because by focusing on one thing, you can really ream out a lot, and you could probably teach students as young as maybe 5, 6,
Yes.
up to and through high school and maybe even college. You're teaching groups who come to have some understanding of what Dali does. And if you could extract a kind of a method to look at Dali and use some of the examples that are actually in the museum.
Right.
Because I would like anybody who's listening who hasn't gone to the Dali, by all means do. It will give you an insight, and there's something very thorough and satisfying about reaming through one artist and his work. So if you were going to take, say, a 15 to 25-year-old
Right.
within that, what would you show them?
Well, the first would probably be early in his career, he does a painting, A Basket of Bread. And this is just a very, very traditional, almost Baroque type of still life painting. It's very much in the tradition of paintings Dali saw in the Prado. And it establishes on some level, certainly in Dali's mind, a level of being a credentialed artist who's arrived as a technician. But then very quickly you move from that very traditional type of painting into some of the paintings after 1929, something like Weaning of Furniture Nutrition, where suddenly you have this, what looks like a snapshot, and you realize that the woman in the very center has a hole in her body. So everything about it looks exacting, like a photograph, but of course he's pulled the rug out from under you and given you something that is somehow not only a surprise, but also an irrational, way of looking at the world. And so we definitely want students or young people to become aware of this kind of level of creativity, that there's no one particular way that you can approach the paintings, that when you're creating, there's a lot of opportunities. And then certainly the double images that we have in our collection are classic opportunities for students to realize that painting doesn't need to be boring, it doesn't need to be disconnected from things that are fun or exciting or interesting. So Dali, as a sort of artist involved with dreams and presenting hand-painted dream photographs, enables people to at least have the license for creative thinking and imagining and giving value to dreams and to these other kinds of ideas. And then we have paintings, of course, the ones that really work the best with students would be, say, the Toreador, the hallucinogenic Toreador, or the Portrait of Abraham Lincoln, where Dali is using a double image as an opportunity for storytelling.
Right.
And he weaves these really fantastic stories into these paintings.
Did he have to work something like what Chuck Close works like? He set up a grid and then find the subgrid.
I don't think he didn't quite work with the level of fastidiousness that Chuck Close uses.
Right.
Chuck Close has a very, very specific technique. Dali was a little more loose, but he would spend almost a year planning each of these large canvases. And we do have, there's anywhere, depending on what the guideline is, anywhere from 18 to 22 very large canvases that Dali painted. And each one of these would be, for Dali, an opportunity to summarize the year's obsessions. And he would spend the year collecting data for these paintings.
Really? Oh, so he changed obsessions
he did. Every year,
time to time.
The topics would change, the focus would change, but he would collect information about what he would want to be his grand painting in the fall, for the fall exhibition in New York. And as a result of it, there are some really fascinating stories that would evolve over the course of the year. And his choice of what to include and not include would definitely change almost up to the point of painting the canvas. So there's not a lot, but there are some photos that document some of the early stages of key paintings like the Toreador.
Right.
And you can really see some major changes happen over time.
when you were talking about the Levy Gallery in New York, I read that there was one point where he was having his first showing in New York, and Levy was showing a kind of a film with other artists talking.
Yes.
And he erupted.
It was Joseph Cornell's film.
Yes,
That's
yes.
right.
And he said he stole all of Dali's ideas, said, that man stole from my subconscious. And then he walked out of the room. I would have imagined it would have affected people's feeling about him. Like,
I think it did. I think it definitely did. For some reason, Julian Levy still kept representing Dali.
That's
but,
right. That was the surprise.
I think Dali was very comfortable making enemies with people unnecessarily. And that particular incident that you're talking about is one of those real moments where you get an insight into just sort of how crazy Dali's approach to interacting with others was.
Yes.
I mean, that's not only is it not having a sense of a collegial, understanding of each other, but it's that idea that even though I haven't expressed my ideas, you've stolen them. I don't know if that was a publicity opportunity or if it truly was Dali just being angry that something he had in his mind seemed to be coming out of someone else's creativity.
That's a good question, because I'm sure he was always aware of the effect he was having on people. But I do think that his subconscious and his impulsive behavior was genuine.
I do too.
Yeah.
He invested so much into constantly reading, thinking, trying to bring new ideas to his paintings that he really was that character.
Oh, that's
on
wonderful.
some level.
And yet he cooperated with Brunel on The Dog of Anna Lucia. And there were others. One of the things I would point out to those who haven't had this experience is that there are so many archival elements that are available to people who come to the Dali in building up not only a complete picture of the artist, but a kind of a feeling for what the time was like too, because he did cooperate and work with a number of other artists. Sometimes they remained friends, but most of the time they didn't, I think. But it was a signal of the time, the era too. Many changes, political and economic, were like seismic shifts, and I think the artists were protesting in the best way, and the only way they knew how to protest, really, with their art.
Absolutely.
But it strikes me that Dali had a little bit more practical turn of mind when it came to that, because he never did leave Spain.
Right. Well, for 8 years, but only during the war years.
Right.
But you're absolutely right. He
Right.
returned to Spain, and it was extremely important to him that he maintained that connection with his native soil.
Yes.
He was fascinated by Velázquez and the court of Philip IV, and Franco had come to power as a result of the Spanish Civil War. And of course, when World War II started, Franco was seen as the enemy, the traitor. He was despised and hated by most of the intelligentsia. It's hard to gauge what Dali's ideas were when he was in the States, but by 1948, he had somehow resolved his feelings about the politics of his country, and he had recreated himself as a monarchist, which really surprised and shocked and led to further alienation with some of his colleagues and friends.
That's right.
But for him, it was more important to be in Spain than anything else, and it was convenient that he could be, in a sense, the painter to the throne, the painter to both the king and to Franco. And so for the remaining decades until the 1970s, when Franco remained in power, Dali was on some level comfortable being the painter to Franco.
Would you give us a little sort of a rundown of some of the works that are in the Dali in St. Petersburg, and tell me what you think is wonderful about them? Things that you probably would have the docents stop at and discuss.
Well, the first thing to say is that the collection we have, except for the large canvases, everything was a painting that was lived with by the Morses in Cleveland. And so there were specific choices they made in their collecting that worked well with paintings hanging in a house as opposed to museum pieces. So that said, there's a lot of pieces, say, from our early period that at the time that they were collecting them, they weren't collecting them with the eye to put them in a museum, but rather to document the life of this person they loved. And so we have some just fascinating and yet perhaps not the best works he did from the sort of Dali's Impressionist period, which would have been the teens and the 20s.
Right.
But we have Basket of Bread, as I mentioned, which is just one of those show-stopping opportunities to see the artist at his very best. We have a number of pieces from the Surrealist period. Probably a couple of the stars would include The Slave Market with the Disappearing Bust of Voltaire, which is a classic double image painting, just absolutely spellbinding. We have a couple examples of his obsession with Jean-Francois Millet's Angelus, which was a very unusual 2-year obsession that went into Freudian territory. He just kept coming back to that painting. We have 7 of those large canvases, the ones that I'd refer to as monumental canvases, which is 1/3 of the entire output he did. Right. So there's great opportunities to see things like the Toreador or the Lincoln painting or the Galaxy desoxyribonucleic acid, where these paintings are their stories and their opportunities for Dali to talk about science and mathematics in relation to the dream state and some of his ideas there.
Interesting. Do you ever get funny or interesting reactions from either children and or adults?
Always.
Always.
Always, yes. Well, one of the things that really
dull.
is, no, not at all. One of the things that always causes one of those ooh or ah moments is when we come to the Lincoln portrait, which was inspired by a photograph about visual perception. And it was just a pixelized image of Abraham Lincoln's face. Dali saw the distorted image and thought, I can turn that into a completely different image without changing much. So when you come upon the painting, what you're seeing is that secondary image. It's an image of his wife in front of a window. But when you distort it, and often some of our docents will use these convex mirrors, and you immediately see in that exact same painting the face of Abraham Lincoln. That's just for everyone, whether you're a child or an adult, there's this moment of euphoria. And so that's a very common moment that happens over and over again in the galleries.
Right. You have to have a certain amount of distance between yourself and the paintings that hide images, and it seemed to me that there were sort of longer, narrower corridors in the new museum to see that, and then it gave a more room to put up maybe some of the watercolors and the other works that you didn't have time, space for actually then. Well, what kind of reactions do some strike you as memorable, as to when anybody in a group of people who are being shown these things by docents?
You mean some of the visitor reactions?
Yes, yeah.
Well, I know, I'm not sure if this is exactly answering that question, but recently Penn and Teller did a performance at the Mahaffey Theater.
Right.
And Teller, who's normally the silent one, he and Penn Jillette went through the collection on their own, and they spent some time there and went down to the gift shop. And then we were in a meeting, and about 2.5 hours later we came out and we realized that Teller had just stayed at the museum, and at that time we had a big prop, a big mustache from a billboard that we had. Right. It was out in our garden. And we watched him, and for about 15 minutes he was interacting with our visitors by either taking their photo or posing for them.
Oh, great.
But he was completely and totally invested in the experience of being at the museum, enjoying it completely. And it was exactly what you hope for.
Right.
It's that sense that, yes, not only does he enjoy it and connect with it, but I think
inspiring.
This is exactly.
Yes, that's
so,
great.
Yeah.
Well, in the time we have left, and it's not that much, tell us about the accompanying exhibit now from the Spanish Museum.
Well, we have a couple things happening. We are participating. We actually have 15 of our most important paintings in Spain, in Madrid, as part of a Dali retrospective. That's absolutely fabulous. If anyone goes to Spain this summer, they absolutely have to see that show. As a result, we have 10 paintings on loan to us from the Reina Sofia, which is the Modern Museum of Spain in Madrid. And they cover Dali's career. They're lesser known works, but they include 3 from the very final years of his career, a couple very early pieces, and a wonderful piece that represents Dali's stereooptic interests. 2 canvases that if you saw them overlapped would become 3-dimensional. So that's a very fun exhibition in our Huff galleries. We also have on loan to us from the Beaverbrook Gallery in Fredericton, New Brunswick, Canada, Dali's second largest painting. Only our Columbus painting is larger.
Is big.
It is huge. It's but this is one inch less than that. But people are just spellbound. It's the Santiago el Grande, and it's an image of St. James on a rearing horse in front of this incredible blue background. People are absolutely adoring it.
Oh, that's great. Our time is running out, but I think we get a pretty good idea of the stimulation, intellectual and aesthetic that can happen at the Dali. And by the way, we didn't say in a very wonderful move that Dali would have approved of. When you first come into the museum, you have to pass through the shop.
The gift shop, absolutely.
The gift shop, yes.
Absolutely.
And the gift shop has so many wonderful melting watches, and do they have any Dali mustaches that you can use for Halloween,
down there,
maybe?
absolutely, or other times, perhaps board meetings, you know, yes,
That's right.
we do.
That would be very, very funny to have all your board members with the Dali mustache. It would be in sync with everything. But do make a plan to go and visit the Dali this summer. Probably you would have the best opportunity to look at those images and those paintings at length, because summer is a kind of the living is easy, and I think it would be a good time. And plan to visit us again. Thanks.
George, it's a great deal. Only used a couple of times, and it gets great parsecs for very little dilithium crystals.
Well, I appreciate the offer, but what I really need is information about Social Security. How do I find out what my monthly payment will be?
Online.
How about if I just want Medicare?
Online?
Oh my. We'll boldly go to socialsecurity.gov.
Let's go kick the tires.
to SaveThePolarBear.org today for more information and to sign the petition to save the polar bear before it's too late.